So, good morning. I'm Sunny Summers, Senior Policy Advisor with the Oregon Department of Ag, and I'm helping guide this ship a little bit. We're going to do a roll call for invited RAC members. And today's meeting is to discuss draft rules for the Lower Umatilla Groundwater Basin Management Area, LUBGWMA. Umatilla Basin Groundwater Management Area. That is a heck of an acronym. And then we will get started. Just as a reminder, invited RAC members are the folks around the table that we have asked to provide feedback during these RAC meetings. They are open to the public, so other folks are welcome to listen in. But we will be limiting comments during this meeting to those invited RAC members or their representatives. So with that, I'm going to go down the list and then we'll get started. So Greg Harris.
Here.
You need privacy.
Perfect. Jeff Svedin.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm here.
Perfect. Ascension Ibarra. No Ascension. Okay. We'll see if he joins us later. Eric Oram.
Yes, good morning, everybody.
Okay. And just a reminder to please keep yourself on mute if you're not talking. Carlos Bonilla.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning, Carlos. Bob Walder.
I'm here, thank you.
Perfect. This is a good time to check our mics as well. So Tamara Mabbitt.
Good morning, Tamara's here.
Good morning. Tom Strawn.
Here.
Okay. Karen Lewatsky.
You can't see me. Now you can see me. Hi.
Good morning, Karen. Justin Green.
Good morning.
Good morning. Jose Garcia. Okay. Cheyenne Holiday.
I'm here.
Oh, good morning. Caleb Blade. Okay. Paul Positer. Good morning. There you are. Okay. Brad Spencer.
Hello and good morning.
Good morning. Danny Lytle.
Good morning, Sunny.
Good morning. Mike Hyatt.
Mike Hyatt, I'm here.
Perfect. Treya Nance.
I'm here. Hi.
Good morning. And Chris Cowitz.
Morning, everybody.
Good morning. Okay, so I see that Caleb joined. Who's on the phone? Is the phone member one of our RAC members? Okay. So looks like we're missing Jose and Ascension. And I'm gonna again ask everybody to mute themselves if they're not talking. Part of my job will be to help you mute if you don't mute. So whoever's on the phone needs to mute themselves. There we go. Okay. We have Isaac, Kevin, and Renee from ODA's Ag Water Quality, and I will turn it over to the three of you.
Thanks, Sunny. Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us again for our third meeting. Thanks for folks who continue to engage also between the last meeting and this one. We had several folks send in additional suggestions or comments or information throughout the last couple of weeks. So that's super helpful. If it doesn't come up to you in this meeting and you want to follow up afterwards, we'll take all of that. We are taking that feedback under consideration and looking about how we can apply that to the rules we discussed and make edits. So Renee has started that process from the sections that we talked about last time. Not all of it's ready to go for another review from this group. So I think what Renee will actually talk from is a more current draft today. So you'll see some stuff that has been changed and she'll point that out. But when we have those other edits more solid and we're ready to bring it back to the group, we'll make sure to walk through the changes in those other sections for everyone, so that we can have another discussion about those pieces that we took under advisement and changed. So be looking for that, and we'll kind of touch a little bit on that today. We'll finish up the animal pasturing section because we didn't quite round that out last time. And then we'll jump into the other 4 sections that were listed in the agenda. So that's the control measures for irrigated ag on large acres, irrigation water management, annual nitrogen budgets, and the contents for those budgets. So that'll be today's discussion. And again, like last time, if we don't get through all of it, we'll just carry that over to the next meeting. So any questions from anyone before we get started? Great. All right, Renee, I'll turn it over to you and we can launch into the language.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I wanted to take a minute to thank everyone who submitted comments to us. And I really appreciated all the oral comments that we received in our last RAC meeting. I'm finding them very helpful. As Isaac mentioned, I'm starting to try to work some of the comments that we heard and that we received into a new draft. All of the comments that we received are not incorporated into this draft. I just received some additional comments very recently, so those aren't in there yet. But I just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to think about these rules and for taking the time to participate in these meetings. I know you're all very busy, but we do really appreciate your feedback. So with that, I'll go ahead and share the draft that I've been working on and start talking through that. We left off talking about pastures. And before I'm going to stop for a minute and ask everyone if you can see the rules that are on the screen and if they're big enough.
That looks great, Renee.
Okay, great. So before we go back to where we left off last week, I just wanted to point out that based on comments that we received, especially I think from you, Karen, very helpful, we decided to expand the definition of fertilizer so that it includes biosolids, biosolid-derived products, compost, and manure, so that throughout the rules, we don't have to list out each one of those things singularly. We can just refer to fertilizer. And so I'm just trying to do that for simplicity's sake and to keep the rules from being wordier than they are. And so I just wanted to point out that change because you'll see that throughout the document. And I see Karen has a question.
Well, I don't know if Karen has a question. Karen has something to say. I just want to point out that in other parts of the country, the nation, people have been conflating or mixing up the terms biosolids and sludge. Those two things are different compounds, although they often both come out of a wastewater treatment plant. I'm not asking or suggesting you necessarily make a change in your language. I'm saying I think it would be a good idea for y'all to check into that and see if that's something that would be relevant to Oregon and the way Oregon handles material. Oh, look, there it is. That
You read my mind, Karen.
Excellent. Okay. Then I would suggest, given what you've got written here, I would suggest you actually perhaps check with like Susie Smith from Aqua or other folks that work carefully or deeply, shall I say, which is kind of a gross image now that I think about it, deeply in the wastewater world, and make sure that those two things are actually aligned. Even if, if they're defined that way, that's one thing, but still in our own work, we want to make sure that we're saying it accurately. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I ran into that whole fun little scenario when I was working on the definition of biosolids. Who's the person you're suggesting I check in with? I didn't get the name.
It's a woman named Susie Smith. I believe Isaac probably has her contact information. She works with the Association of Clean Water Agencies.
Okay.
If neither of you can track her down, just flag me and I'll send her contact information, or I can put it in the chat if you want me to.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. So moving on, I just wanted to point that out. The other change is that instead of referring to soil water holding capacity, Dr. Bonilla was really helpful in bringing me up to speed on accepted scientific terms, always a benefit. And so I did change that and deleted the term soil water moisture holding capacity and adopted field water capacity from the academic definition of that. And so you'll see that the edit that soil water holding capacity is no longer used, but that we're using field water capacity instead. So thank you, Dr. Bonilla. And I hope I can follow up with Dr. Bonilla later this week to get a better understanding of some of these terms so that I'm not using them incorrectly. So scrolling down to animal pasturing, you'll see that we're thinking about deleting the reference to the buffer strip because there were a lot of folks who were concerned that that was a, kind of a BMP that doesn't address groundwater so much as it addresses surface water. Point taken. So we have some, language that kind of deletes the buffer strip, but talks about how you handle manure and waste feed from these heavy use areas so that they don't result in leaching into the groundwater. So when I do get this draft finished up and nailed down, I'll ask Sunny to post it so you can take a look at this and we can continue bouncing our thoughts off of it. But I just thought I'd point that out to you before we move on to subsection 3, which is, I believe, where we left off. And so if there aren't any questions, shall I go ahead and continue the format that we used in the last meeting where I read the rule and then you guys commented? It looks like we have one hand up.
Good morning, Renee. I really appreciate you going over the changes that you made. And I noticed that you made changes to the definition of a field. And I think that's really going to come into play with the talk today. So I was hoping you could give us what your current thinking is on that.
So the current definition of field is derived from past precedent by the Oregon Department of Agriculture and the way they've defined field in other programs. It's a definition that's been reviewed by the Oregon Court of Appeals, and so I felt confident in putting it forward as a definition for field. I don't think that we've yet resolved the management unit over field discussion, and so I haven't, the changes to the definition of field really don't touch on that discussion very much. So I think that we're still hashing that out as a policy matter, and hopefully in the next draft that we can share with you, we'll have that nailed down in one way or the other. Does that help you understand?
Yeah, would you mind just reviewing the language so everybody's on the same page?
I don't mind. I'm just scrolling if you'll bear with me. So field means an area of land that is used for agricultural activities and enclosed or otherwise distinguished by physical characteristics of the property such as roads, fences, topography, or other barriers, and is characterized by a uniform irrigation system, crop type, and system of nutrient management measures. So what this definition does is it focuses kind of on the physical attributes of a field as well as the management decisions that are made when a grower designates an area as a field.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page before we got further into this. So I appreciate that.
Sure. Are we ready to move back to pastures? We got one more question. Should I scroll back to field?
No, this isn't about field. It's actually about the simplifying the definition of fertilizer.
Oh, okay.
One comment I have is I think one of the rules is you can't apply and it has kind of stuff written out within 30 days. If it's saying you can't apply fertilizer and that includes everything you included, you will have food safety violations if you're applying compost and stuff within 30 days of planting. So if we're going to use the term fertilizer, we will have to, I think you're going to have to think about when you're going to call out when it's okay to apply certain amendments, just because for food safety, you can't do that.
Yeah, Jeff,
So
Right.
that's my comment.
that's a good comment, and Danny had raised that too, out between the meetings, as well. So I think that's one of the things we haven't incorporated the change yet, so nothing necessarily to share in terms of new draft language, but definitely a comment, that we've received. So thanks.
Yeah, I like this. I think I like the simplifying to fertilizer to include all those things just for clarity, but just make sure you call out where there's going to be exceptions, I think is something to keep in mind.
Okay, got it. All right. Okay, animal pasturing. Subsection 3. A landowner applying fertilizer to irrigated pasture shall conduct nutrient management in a manner that prevents the over-application of nitrogen and reduces the likelihood of nitrate leaching to groundwater. Subsection A landowner applying fertilizers to pasture shall first conduct a soil test consistent with the soil sample rule to establish plant available nitrogen in the soil. Subsection 4. A landowner shall prevent the downward movement of nitrate in the soil by managing irrigation water so that the amount of water applied from the combination of precipitation and irrigation does not exceed the soil's field water holding capacity within the forage root depth. And thus ends pastures. Are we ready to move on? Okay. So here we take a big break. The rules that we have just been going over in the last meeting and beginning of this one apply to everybody, all of the growers in the LUBGWMA who are irrigating acreages to grow crops or pasture animals. Now we're moving to a different provision of the program, and these are rules that only govern what we call agricultural activities on irrigated agricultural lands, where the total land acreage under the ownership or control of a landowner is equal to or greater than 1,000 acres, and where irrigation is used to grow crops or pastures on those acreages. And so as a shortcut term, we just call this like the large irrigated acreage program, which is distinct from the smaller irrigated acreage management. And we have a question, it looks like.
Yes, sorry, just back on animal pasturing, sorry to go backwards a little bit, but does the act of putting animals on a pasture and them applying manure, is that considered applying manure to a pasture? Or fertilizer to a pasture?
Yes,
So before any animals are put on a pasture, it needs to be soil sampled.
if they're going to fertilize the pasture.
But don't animals fertilize the pasture?
Well, I don't think that that's the intent of the rules, is to require that kind of testing. I think the focus of the rules is more on the application, like other than the animals that are applying it themselves.
Okay, I just wanted
Yeah,
to
Greg,
clarify that, yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
There's-
Sorry.
I just want to clarify that because if there's, you know, I mean, it could be open for interpretation. So I just want to make sure that's clarified in the rules. That's not the intent, or it is the intent.
Yeah, that's a good point, Greg, because I know there are some folks even out in that area that are looking at management techniques for beef cattle or whatever that are on
Right,
rangeland or other pastures as a land application method for spreading their manure. But I think what Renee said is correct. We're not envisioning these rules looking at the animals themselves applying the manure as a application technique. Maybe it looks like Karen might have a comment or a question about that.
Well, as I put in the chat, I think Greg's hit something here, although I got to admit it slipped right past me, because there are pasturing methodologies that explicitly talk about this when you look at guidelines for how to run cattle under this kind of approach or that kind of approach. You can actually see that approach taking the position that what's happening here is fertilizer application. So I think that clarifying that is probably worth the extra line or two that it's going to put in the rule.
Okay, do we have any more comments on pastures?
Quickly, just want to jump in and echo what's being said here. I think it's important for us to clarify on this point, especially. It's a good catch, Greg, and I agree with what Karen's saying. I think it's pretty common practice for, like someone to graze some cattle on a circle. I mean, that is fundamentally different from like adding one more horse to your pasture or, adding 2 more chickens, just some additional language to distinguish the commercial or scaled activities from just your everyday sort of throwing one more horse, one more cow out in your back pasture. That might be helpful here.
Okay. Anyone else?
Can I ask a clarifying question, Caleb? So are you suggesting that the rules should address folks who graze cattle on a pivot versus someone who is grazing animals in their managed pasture as a separate thing?
Maybe, yeah. It just seems like, if you're adding, let's say you got 5 horses in your pasture, you live out on the edge of town, making that 6 and still managing your manure in that same area is one thing versus introducing 200 head to a circle where they're not normally grazing and then taking them off, like a before and after on that area that's not typically used as a paddock or a pasture. That might be helpful here, just in doing like the mass balance, right? Am I making sense? Is that tracking?
Yeah, I'm just trying to track in my brain the actual difference between the two. In that, like, if you're flash grazing some animals across a pivot, whether they're typically there or not, versus someone who has a certain number of head of cattle, whether that's a small or a large amount that are routinely grazed in an area.
Yeah.
Justin?
Yeah, thank you. It's Justin Green. I just want to make kind of a high level comment that the last couple of meetings we've gotten in, really good conversations, getting into the weeds on some of these provisions. Maybe this was just me. My recollection of, at the beginning of this process was that these rules were more just related to having a nutrient management plan. The level of detail, who prepared those, would depend on the size of the farm. But I think that you'll see in comment letters from me that I think we're getting down in the weeds on this is concerning because the potential of unintended consequences. Once again, my understanding of this rule at the beginning of this process was that it was really a requirement that you have a nutrient management plan. The size of your farm kind of dictates who prepares that, et cetera. But going into these minutia levels, it's like this is sounding more like a land application WPCF DEQ permit than ODA rules to me. So I just want to raise that. I don't have any specific changes to language, but just kind of want to raise that broad concern.
Well, so to clarify, the rulemaking is targeted at addressing additionality of nitrate sources. So there isn't a direct charge. I think I see Bob's comment in there, like focus on the charge of the rulemaking. The rulemaking is to address nutrient use within the basin, and its impact to groundwater. And so I think it is appropriate for us to get into the weeds on some of these things to make sure that we don't create rules that create dead ends or unintended consequences by the way they're drafted, and thinking about the scenarios and the potential scenarios that may encounter based off of activity in the area. So whether it's a source of nutrients from small, medium, large vegetable production, onions, cattle, like those are all agricultural practices that have impacts to groundwater potentially. And so that's what the scope of the rules is.
Yeah, and maybe I wasn't clear. I definitely understand that. I think having these conversations is really important. I think the rules themselves getting into the weeds. So the rules I'm looking at right now, I think is getting into too much detail and has that intention that has the possibility of unintended consequences. If we're going to have these provisions in the rule, then absolutely we need to be having these conversations. And I'm learning a lot through these. This is a good thing. I'm just kind of flagging it as a concern of mine that the rules themselves are getting so far in the weeds that we have that potential for unintended consequences. If that's the way this rule ends up going, that's out of my control. But if it does, like, just want to flag once again to make sure that we have the time to have the conversations like the ones that we're having, that we just had about pastors. Very good conversation. Support that conversation. If we're going to go into this amount of detail in the rules, but my overall concern is just the level of detail that we're going into the rules and the possibility for unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we're balancing, and Renee can speak a little bit to this too, is the level of detail that's necessary to make sure that they're clear and enforceable. So, simply saying like, don't do X makes it very difficult for the agency to have a clear pathway for how do we address those nuances. So it's kind of like we're talking like, don't pollute waters of the state. Okay, well, what does that mean, and how do people do that, and how are we going to ensure that people aren't doing that? And that's part of the reason for these rules, right? So I get what you're saying, Justin. Like, you can make rules overly cumbersome and like trying to address every situation, which makes them hard to navigate, versus that balance of like, hey, how do we make this very clear about where the line is and what the expectations are for folks? So I don't know, Renee, if you have anything to add to that as like, the author and crafter of a lot of the language, but we're trying to balance those things.
Yeah, I think we're trying to stay away from being too prescriptive, Justin. I think that the structure of the pasture rule, if that's the one that's giving you heartburn, is a little different than the structure in the rest of the rules. To me, the animal pasturing rule is more like a best management practice than you'll see in the other provisions of the rules, which are really assessment tools and results oriented. And so I take your comment to heart, and I think we'll talk about that at ODA. And if other folks have feedback on that point, that would be helpful to hear as well. Just keep in mind that this is a work in progress. So don't get overly invested in feeling like this is the end all and be all. Your comments are important, and we'll be sure to talk about them, and maybe you'll see some changes in the further drafts.
I appreciate that. And yeah, my concerns aren't just restricted to the pasture section. In the last meeting, we talked about prohibited acts, et cetera, and there was potential for unintended consequences there. It just seems like we're writing that this rule is writing the nutrient management plan for farmers rather than the rulemaking being based on having a nutrient management plan. Having a farmer have a nutrient management plan that identifies all sources of nutrients and how they're handled. So it's just, this is a high level comment on approach. And Karen, I think, has had her hand up for a while.
But before we leave this, Justin, if you want to send us like some specific comments on the rules where you're feeling like this is becoming a problem or a certain wording is likely to lead to unintended consequences, please do that, because it is helpful.
I very much appreciate that. Thank you.
And Karen?
Yeah, thanks. I guess I'm less concerned about the weeds that we're getting into in this discussion than Justin, although I take his point. I think that when this is a new approach that we're using, and people are going to be relying on it to guide practices that have pretty large economic and natural resource consequences. I think all the clarity we can give people is helpful, particularly since sometimes one agency partner looks at the other agency partner's language, and if it's not clear, they might be using it in different ways or different meanings or something. I just feel like for the purposes of this, it's worth having these conversations and perhaps getting pretty specific about what we're discussing in order to get to the level of clarity that will allow us to function without running into huge challenges or back and forths about, well, you said that word and this word means that to me and blah, blah. And I realize you can go too far down that rabbit hole and I should stop talking. But that's what I'm thinking.
Got it. Okay. Thanks all. It's a tricky topic, that's for sure. Are we ready to move on in interest of time? So kind of Justin, to your point, the program that we're talking about now is more of an assessment tool for farmers to use, and it's a lot less prescriptive. It just talks about it hopefully providing tools for growers to figure out how to manage nitrogen on their specific sites. So it's a lot, it's really different from the animal pasturing rules. And so jumping in subsection 1, we're delineating the fact that this is the large irrigated acres programs. And subsection 2, we say these area rules describe those irrigation and nitrogen management measures necessary to minimize percolation of waste to groundwater and prevent excess nitrogen application relative to crop need. Subsection A, measures include irrigation water management, an annual nitrogen budget, and annual post-harvest summary records. Records that implement these measures shall be retained by the landowner at the landowner's principal place of business for the agricultural operation and made available for inspection at the request of the department. Now, this was a big policy choice by ODA. Rather than asking growers to submit their records to ODA wants to put the focus on growers creating the records and then using them for their own assessment purposes for their specific sites. Subsection 3. Each landowner shall.
Renee,
Yeah.
real quick. Does it
okay.
say anywhere how long they have to keep those records?
No, we don't have that in rule, Sunny, and we should talk about that. Because again, this is an assessment tool for landowners. But we can think about that point. Subsection 3, each landowner shall employ best practicable management practices to implement the irrigation and nitrogen management measures in these area rules according to the site-specific attributes and needs of each agricultural operation. So as you can see, this is like not prescriptive. This is an assessment tool that you use on your specific site. Best practicable management practices, that comes from the statute that governs the groundwater management areas. And if you want to discuss what that means, we can do that, but I see that there's a hand up.
Yeah, I just have 2 comments. The first one is it says landowner. There's a lot of rented properties. So who is responsible? So it's the landowner based on the current write-up that's responsible to maintain these records, even though a lot of the times they're not the one that is performing the operations.
So I suggest you go back to the definition of landowner in the definition section, because you'll see that it includes everybody, including
Okay,
operators
it
and
does.
people who are renting the land. Yeah, it's kind of a
Okay,
very expansive definition.
okay,
But
great.
that's just the term that the statute uses, landowner. I mean, I didn't pick it. So.
Okay. My
Um,
my other comment is the cutoff on 1,000 acres. Do you guys have an idea of how many people will actually be impacted by these? Because I don't know if it's actually that many in terms of operations over 1,000 acres. Um I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. Maybe some other people have some, but I I I don't think it's more than 20 people, 20 operations. I think it would be lower and may perhaps significantly lower than that. So again, that's just my feel for the area. I don't know that, but
Yeah.
maybe other people in this group could comment on that. So if you want this to have impact across a lot of operations, that 1,000 acres is might need to be looked at.
We did look at USDA census data to try and get an understanding of what that could be. I don't have those notes in front of me, but that's part of what we looked at to kind of, you know, put a number on paper as a starting point. It's one of the challenges we have as an agency. We don't actually know who's farming what acres or what size of operations folks have, right? Because we can't really use tax lots to look at that. Because as you said, like it's been pointed out, people lease a lot of acres or you know, those types of situations. So it's difficult to tell. But we did look at ag census data to try and get a sense for what was reported through there about size of operations. And then, I can't remember, Jeff, off the top of my head, what that number of potential farms was, but I could go back and look in our notes.
I remember thinking it was more than I expected.
Yeah.
So are we ready to move on? Okay, the first component of the large irrigated acreage program is irrigation water management. So subsection 1 says a landowner subject to these rules shall prevent the downward movement of nitrate in the soil by managing irrigation water so that the amount of water applied from the combination of precipitation and irrigation does not exceed the soil's field capacity within the crop rooting depth. So this is really the gist of it. Like this is probably the trickiest piece too, given the nature of the soils, sandy soils in this area. So it's no small task, but we think that as a policy matter, it's extremely important that growers manage their irrigation so that they're not leaching nitrate beyond the crop's rooting depth where it will eventually migrate into the groundwater. Subsection 2. A landowner subject to these rules shall base the volume of water needed for each irrigation event on at least the following information as relevant to a crop or field. A, available field water capacity of the soil for their crop rooting depth. B, management allowed soil water depletion. C, current soil moisture status. D, distribution uniformity of the irrigation event. E, water table contribution. F, computerized irrigation scheduling recommendation. So if you're wondering where we got all of this stuff, we got it from the NRCS water management code. Oh, what is it? I think it's like 449. It's in the materials that we gave to you. And you'll see that this is pretty much tracking that recommendation by the NRCS, and we have a hand up.
So 2 questions. Is it all the above or a combination? And then my second question on F, occasionally we grow crops in this area where there is not an irrigation scheduling recommendation or not one's been put together. Say for Eastern Oregon versus Western Oregon, there can be a significant difference in ETs. There can be significant difference in ETs within the same crop, whether it be potatoes, different varieties, 8 different varieties, we irrigate them 8 different ways. And there's times with ETs, I would kill a crop because it over irrigates substantially. So there's on that one in particular, I think there needs to be some flexibility, like maybe if available or something along those lines, because they're not all available. And you know, there's still better ways, even than what you've managed here or have here, that if that's not available and it's all the above, then you're out of compliance.
Yeah, so
I
I think
think it
that's
should
a,
be a combination of. Not
yeah,
all.
it's a good point. I was looking at this rule the other day and I was like, wow, this is one of those tricky rules and this only a lawyer can do. I sat there and contemplated the semicolon for about half an hour, trying to figure out if it was an, sorry, this is what I do. I'm a geek. If it was an and or an or if it actually functioned as both, which sometimes the semicolon can do. So I do think that it merits from some clarification. But the intent, I think, is that, as you articulated, and I'm not sure who's speaking because I just see your initials, GH, that this is as the information is available, and it's not supposed to be a restrictive list because it's at least the following information. So generally, the intent is whatever information that is at the grower's disposal should be taken into consideration. But I think that's a good point, and I will continue to ponder the wording of this subsection, but hopefully my comments clarify the intent.
It was Greg Harris, by the way. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Greg.
And we have Danny.
Yeah, I wanted to echo Greg's comment. I was really concerned with the reading that all of those components needed to be used, which it would be very, very intensive irrigation scheduling. The other question that I had was whether there's supposed to be recording of this.
Well, it's not required in the rule, but it seems like a grower might want to record that kind of information. It depends on their management, you know. How accurate do you want to be?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if the rule was requiring record keeping of this.
It would say specifically if it were.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and Danny, right now, when we get to that section, the only part that talks about irrigation is the nitrogen applied through irrigation. So that's what's listed there at this point.
Yeah, we'll move into that when we talk about the annual nitrogen budget. Thank you for that comment, Isaac.
Okay,
We have a
Karen?
couple, yeah.
Again, Karen. I just wanted to say that I actually appreciate this specificity. I feel like working with folks in ag across the state, people feel like it's not clearly understood, sometimes even by ODA, I guess, that all of these things are very particular to a very particular crop and a very particular soil type and climate regime, et cetera. And so being able to show that this rule is taking that into account makes it, I think, really valuable in the LUBGWMA, but also presents it as a model for how to think about future nitrogen management. So I know it seems like it's drilling down and just getting really, really dense, but I actually appreciate it. So thanks.
Thanks, Karen. Brad?
Yeah, I just had, I guess just housekeeping type things in the verbiage. So for A, available field water capacity, I'm assuming you're going to use field capacity or specify field capacity. And then, see
I
here.
think
What
there's
was the other-
someone
oh,
who's not muted besides
I think that's
Brad.
just background in Brad's office.
Oh, I'm sorry.
no,
Yeah.
it's not me. I'm alone.
Oh, it's not you.
It was
Okay.
my office. I
Oh.
apologize. I muted
Sorry.
myself.
And then the other one that I was looking at is the distribution uniformity. Like, are we using the Christensen uniformity coefficient? Like, I think there needs to be some specific measurements added to this requirement if it's going to be required. Like everyone said, it's kind of, it's a lot of requirements. They need to be specific, I guess.
Okay. Specify which ones, specify which methodology.
A measurable, I guess, a way to measure it, because yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
So
So
would it be
Dr. Bonilla,
maybe,
maybe you can help me with that, or?
well, and maybe Carlos can answer this question too. I hear Brad's point. So would it make more sense to call out the need to like the grower to identify which methodology that they're using instead of the state specifying a particular one?
Yeah, you're correct. I agree with Brad. Actually, I have two comments now. In the first one, I think he's right. In the way that it was worded now, we don't need to put the word available in A, because actually we want to compute the field capacity at that, because the available, it will be in C, which is the current soil moisture status.
So delete availability.
The available in
Okay.
A, because actually
Okay.
that defines the threshold, which is the maximum amount of water that we want to have in the soil. And the second one, and I agree with all of the comments. There's different way to get or to compute the right amount of water. So here we have a list of options and combination that everything is related to number one, which is whatever is the process that you are following, you don't have to go beyond the field capacity. And you can do it using a software, computer, a sensor in the field. There's different options. So I agree with the comment that you don't have to go from A to F to really compute it. They are options that you can combine, but the main purpose is to my understanding, is one, which is it's not intuitive. You have to really stay below the field capacity in the soil.
Thank you, Dr. Bonilla. And to your point, it was a real distinctive policy choice that ODA would not be requiring, soil moisture probes or requiring different methodologies for calculating soil moisture. We wanted to stay away from that and instead ask people to think about these things and assess their irrigation management in light of the stated goal in subsection 1, that you don't want to drive nutrients beyond the crop root depth. Sure. And so, again, this is not a prescriptive rule. This is leaving a lot of discretion to growers to figure out how to do this that's consistent with their technology and their methodology and their specific site.
Yeah.
We have JS has a hand up.
Jeff.
This is Jeff. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of maybe speak out to the idea of coefficients or recommended coefficients being in this, as I think that falls into the too prescriptive. If this is just a list of ways you can schedule your water, and if you're not required to use all of them, if it's just you're not even going to report on it, that I just would hate to get more descriptive with the language. That's kind of I think it's pretty self-evident for the I think the part that's a little vague is if you have to use all of them or one of them, and I would not want to get more specific than that, because I think that falls into the too prescriptive, which I think everyone's aligned with saying we don't want to do that. So that's my comment, which might be a little bit different from the rest of the group.
Isn't it amazing the power of a semicolon? Okay, any other comments? Okay. Subsection 3. A landowner subject to these rules shall plan the rate and volume of irrigation water to minimize the transport of nutrients to groundwater by A, controlling the rate of water application to limit the transport of nitrogen through the soil profile to groundwater, and B, matching irrigation and application quantities and rates to the crop, soil type, soil moisture content, and agronomic demands of each crop type, such that the irrigation does not exceed the soil's infiltration rate or field water capacity within the crop root zone. Again, this is not prescriptive, but this is telling landowners what's expected in their assessment of their methodology to achieve compliance.